What would you choose if you had plenty of oil? Sell it cheaply to a neighbor who can slap tariffs on you anytime, or take on one of the world's most difficult engineering projects through frozen mountains just to deliver your oil straight to global buyers. Until now, Canada chose the easy road. But then the United States made a mistake. It imposed tariffs on Canadian goods, and Canada snapped. It didn't whine. It retaliated. It picked up a drill and went to war with geography itself. And now the impossible is done. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is not just a project, it's a statement. And the message is clear. Canada is no longer content being anyone's gas station. But how did this happen? And what does Canada plan to do now that the world is watching? In this video, let's find out. Let's rewind a bit. By 2023, Canada was producing nearly 5 million barrels of oil per day, placing it among the top oil producers in the world. But this output came with a dangerous flaw. Almost 97% of it was exported to a single customer, the United States. While that might sound like economic efficiency, it was in fact a geopolitical vulnerability. Canada had oil but not power. Its crude was locked into one pipeline system flowing south, giving Washington an unofficial monopoly over Canadian exports. This lack of market access meant that Canadian oil, especially Western Canadian Select, was consistently sold at steep discounts, often $20 to $30 lower than global benchmarks. The losses weren't abstract. They were real and massive. In a single year, it meant billions of dollars stripped from Canadian oil producers, communities, and public services. Revenue that could have been reinvested in healthcare, infrastructure, or education was instead lost to the inefficiencies of a one-directional trade route. What kept Canada stuck in this trap wasn't a lack of resources, but a lack of infrastructure. The original Trans Mountain Pipeline, built in 1953, was a Cold War relic. It couldn't handle the surge in production that came with modern extraction technologies. Worse, it flowed only in one direction, south, binding Canada's economic fate to the whims of its neighbor. To break free, Canada needed a route westward, toward the Pacific Ocean. But that would mean confronting one of the world's most punishing landscapes: the Rocky Mountains, frozen wetlands, salmon-rich rivers, and contested indigenous territories. Building a new path would be one of the hardest undertakings in Canadian history, but for Ottawa, the stakes had become too high to ignore. The time had come to stop bleeding wealth and start carving a new direction. What unfolded in the Canadian West wasn't just a construction project. It was a declaration of sovereignty laid in steel. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, called TMX, became one of the most challenging and ambitious infrastructure feats ever attempted in North America. At stake wasn't just oil delivery, but a fundamental reshaping of Canada's role in global energy markets. The goal was audacious: stretch a new pipeline over 1,150 kilometers, cutting through the vast Alberta plains, winding through the Rocky Mountains, and descending into the densely populated coastline of British Columbia. The pipeline would carry up to 890,000 barrels of oil per day to the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby, where it could finally reach ships bound for Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world. On paper, the TMX was described as a twinning of the original 1953 Trans Mountain Line, essentially laying a second pipe alongside the old one. But that simplification belied the scope of the work. The new route wasn't a mirror image. It was a reinvention, needing to adapt to modern safety standards, new environmental regulations, and massive increases in capacity. And as it turned out, twinning a pipeline across a continent riddled with both natural and political fault lines was far from simple. The first battle wasn't against nature. It was against public opinion. Environmental advocacy groups warned about pipeline spills, marine traffic, and long-term ecological damage. First Nations leaders demanded genuine consultation over territorial rights, many of which had never been formally seeded. Legal challenges flooded the courts, and by 2018, the original backer, Kinder Morgan, reached a breaking point. The company pulled the plug, citing too much political uncertainty and regulatory risk. It appeared the project had died on the drawing board, but that's when Canada made a dramatic move. In a rare and bold intervention, the federal government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stepped in and nationalized the project, purchasing it for 4.5 billion Canadian dollars. The decision was controversial. Critics called it a misuse of public funds and an environmental betrayal. Supporters hailed it as a necessary act of economic survival. Regardless of the politics, one thing became clear: TMX was no longer a corporate gamble. It was now a nation-building exercise. Construction resumed in 2019, and the next few years became a brutal war against geography. In Alberta, pipeline engineers deployed horizontal directional drilling techniques to burrow pipe segments under sensitive wetlands and farmlands. HDD allowed pipelines to pass beneath without disturbing the surface, like threading a needle underground, protecting ecosystems while advancing construction. But that was the easy part. The real monster loomed farther west, the Canadian Rockies. Here, progress slowed to a crawl. Construction crews had to blast through solid granite, reinforce unstable cliffs, and thread pipes across deep ravines. In areas like Jacko Lake, the terrain became so unstable that construction halted entirely. Slope failures forced teams to pause for weeks, while engineers redesigned entire sections with steel anchors, retaining walls, and advanced geotechnical slope stabilization systems. In winter, the fight intensified. Avalanches, freezing rain, and sub-zero temperatures turned already dangerous work into life-threatening operations. Crews sometimes moved just meters per day. Every mile of pipe laid was a victory not just over terrain, but over doubt. Meanwhile, in the Fraser Valley, home to rich ecosystems and indigenous communities, construction teams had to coordinate not just engineering operations but diplomatic ones. Constant consultation with local governments and First Nations became part of the process. As one engineer described it, "We weren't just building infrastructure, we were building trust." As the pipeline approached the coast, the final phase began. The original 1953 pipeline, dormant in some sections, was inspected, pressure tested, and upgraded to modern safety standards. Engineers reactivated over 200 kilometers of vintage infrastructure, merging it seamlessly with the new twin line. Near the coast, the Westridge Marine Terminal underwent a complete transformation. By May 2024, the site featured 3 new deep-water tanker berths, 19 high-capacity oil storage tanks, advanced spill prevention and containment systems, and automated pumping stations and emergency response teams on permanent standby. When the final weld was sealed and the pipeline pressurized, it didn't just signal the completion of an engineering project. It marked a new chapter in Canadian energy independence. Oil began to flow westward, not south, not to a single buyer, but to the open ocean, to global markets. Overnight, Canada's westbound oil export capacity tripled, from 300,000 barrels per day to 900,000. But more importantly, the psychological shift was seismic. For the first time in decades, Canada had created a parallel trade route, a second energy highway that bypassed its reliance on the United States. It was a geopolitical valve that could redirect supply and reshape alliances. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, and current affairs impacting your lives. This wasn't just a pipe, it was an escape hatch, a release valve from a decades-old dependency, a steel pathway from subordination to sovereignty. And it had been built, not in boardrooms or behind closed diplomatic doors, but through mud, granite, snow, and resistance. Through risk, rebellion, and sheer national will. In a world defined by energy power, Canada had done what few thought possible. It built its own door to the world. When the final weld of the Trans Mountain Expansion project was sealed in May 2024, it marked more than the completion of a pipeline. It marked the beginning of a financial renaissance for Canada. After decades of exporting almost all its oil to a single buyer, the United States, Canada had finally carved an exit door to the world. The Pacific Ocean, once a distant dream in Canada's energy map, was now directly accessible via Burnaby's Westridge Marine Terminal. And with it came a new kind of freedom. The ability to sell oil not at a loss, but at a premium. The numbers reflect this seismic shift. Within months of TMX going online, Canada's oil exports soared to a historic high of 4.8 million barrels per day. The total value of these exports reached $124 billion, nearly 16% of the country's total economy. This wasn't theoretical growth. It was concrete, quantifiable, and immediate. For the first time in years, Canadian producers like Suncor, Cenovus, and Canadian Natural Resources weren't forced to sell their oil at $20 to $30 discounts per barrel. The price gap between Western Canadian Select and global benchmarks like Brent crude narrowed drastically, sometimes to within a few dollars. Every barrel that once sold at a loss was now sold at full global value, unlocking billions of dollars that had long been left on the table. These profits didn't just vanish into corporate balance sheets. They flowed into communities, provinces, and national programs. TMX is projected to contribute $24 billion to Canada's GDP annually over the next 20 years. Governments, both federal and provincial, are expected to collect over $46 billion in additional tax and royalty revenue. That's new money for schools, hospitals, clean water infrastructure, Indigenous health programs, and affordable housing initiatives. The job impact of TMX has also been transformational. The project generated nearly 38,000 jobs during its construction phase alone. More importantly, it wasn't just big contractors that benefited. Over 3,600 of those positions were filled by Indigenous workers, and more than $6 billion Canadian dollars in contracts were awarded to Indigenous-owned businesses, many of which were able to reinvest that capital directly into their communities. In a country where economic reconciliation is an ongoing promise, TMX proved that energy projects can also be pathways to partnership, inclusion, and equity. However, the true power of the pipeline lies not in what it built, but in what it unlocked. Now that Canadian crude can flow west, tankers from Vancouver are no longer heading only to refineries in the U.S. Gulf. They are turning toward Shanghai, Yokohama, Mumbai, Rotterdam, and Busan. Between May and November 2024 alone, China purchased over 2.3 billion Canadian dollars worth of Canadian oil, a deal that would have been nearly impossible without the Pacific route. European nations, especially Spain and the Netherlands, imported over 6.7 million metric tons. India, with its growing demand and refinery capacity, has expressed interest in long-term energy partnerships. South Korea and Japan, energy-hungry nations with strategic interests in diversifying away from Middle Eastern crude, are also lining up. For the first time in decades, Canada has leverage. It is no longer at the mercy of one buyer's price controls or policy whims. It's not just exporting oil, it's exporting on its own terms. The TMX has transformed Canada from a price taker into a price setter, a supplier that can play multiple markets against one another to secure better deals, strategic alliances, and long-term security. And that's where it gets dangerous and threatening for the United States. In the decades before TMX, the energy dynamic between Canada and the United States was both consistent and deeply lopsided. Canada produced the oil. The United States bought nearly all of it. For over 50 years, this rhythm went uninterrupted. Refineries across the American Midwest and Gulf Coast were built specifically to process heavy Canadian crude. And Canadian producers were content, though not thrilled, to offload their barrels to a reliable neighbor. But this relationship worked only because Canada had no real alternative. The U.S. was the buyer, the infrastructure, and the bargaining power all rolled into one. It dictated the price. Canada, with its oil landlocked and its west coast bottlenecked, had little choice but to agree. Then came TMX, and everything changed. The change didn't happen in a vacuum. In 2025, emboldened by years of trade skirmishes and nationalist rhetoric, the U.S. proposed a 10% tariff on Canadian energy imports. It was a strategic gambit, meant to exert pressure and remind Ottawa who was boss. But the move came too late. Canada, with its newly completed Trans Mountain expansion, had already built a backdoor, one that opened directly onto global markets. Almost immediately, the threat of a tariff sent tremors through the energy markets. Investors who once saw Canadian oil as a safe play for U.S.-centric demand began to panic. Share prices wobbled, trade analysts raised alarms, and, more importantly, American refineries were forced to reckon with a costly truth. They couldn't simply swap out Canadian heavy crude for another source. Their equipment, fine-tuned for Alberta's specific blend, couldn't process lighter Middle Eastern or African crude without expensive upgrades, some estimated in the hundreds of millions per facility, with timelines stretching into years. In other words, the United States suddenly realized it was dependent too, and that dependency had grown quietly in the background without ever being fully acknowledged. Meanwhile, Canada had already made its move. While Washington was flexing, Ottawa was sailing. Literally, new oil tankers were leaving British Columbia's ports, carrying Canadian crude to refineries in Shanghai, Mumbai, Yokohama, and Rotterdam. These weren't theoretical deals. They were real, executed contracts, evidence that Canada was no longer boxed into a one-lane trade route. The pipeline had transformed into a geopolitical pivot, one that flipped decades of dependency on its head. Now, TMX isn't just a piece of steel in the ground. It's a statement, a declaration that Canada will no longer wait for approval to access global prosperity. With this single pipeline, Canada has redefined what energy independence means in a 21st century economy. It's not about isolation. It's about optionality. The ability to choose where, when, and to whom you sell is the cornerstone of true sovereignty. TMX gave Canada that option, and it changed the energy map of North America in the process. Now, instead of being a captive supplier to the United States, Canada is becoming a global energy player. Oil is flowing west to Asia's booming economies, where demand continues to climb and energy security is becoming a central political issue. Buyers in China, Japan, South Korea, and India are eager for long-term, stable supply routes. And Canada, with its democratic stability and environmental oversight, is an attractive partner. Europe, too, is realigning. With Russian oil under sanctions and the continent's own production declining, Canadian crude offers a non-Russian, non-OPEC alternative that's both ethical and reliable. Ports in the Netherlands, Spain, and France are already receiving shipments that, just a year ago, would have been impossible without U.S. infrastructure in the way. What do you think? Has the United States lost its biggest oil reserve in the form of Canada? Isn't it true that now, Canada would become the next Saudi Arabia, changing its fate, which it could not by partnering only with the United States? In the comment section below, share your thoughts on how this will make the United States irrelevant in the oil market. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, changing world order, and current affairs. Things you need to stay informed. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.